Hello, this is Mary Harris from Paper Crow. Thanks for joining me today. Hey guys, I'm here today working on some projects using old postcards that I've gotten for very cheap because they are a bit tacky and not really usable for most projects, but look at the beautiful handwriting and aging on those postcards. I don't want this side to go to waste, so I found ways to highlight the postcard writing. So I have this little cloth and paper booklet that I made. I have some pages in there for journaling, but also left an edge to show that there's the writing underneath. And I just love this old cursive. I did do a little bit to make these ones a little more aged. Similar to this one is naturally occurring, like it got water on it during postage. But this one is a bit fresh, so we might do a little bit to age that while we're working on it. I need to pick some fabric. I have these sort of bundles of fabric by color or by holiday sometimes, and I want one that will look decent with the postcard. I have this one's a bit of like an older looking pattern. Some of these are, I don't know if the orange will be too tacky, look too pumpkin-y, or maybe too firm. I'm really in the mood for doing things that are red. Maybe it's Valentine's Day coming up. I think that's a bit too loud, so I'm thinking the flowers are probably going to be the best bet. I do have, this is not too bad. Actually, that kind of looks good. It has a bit of an older, dirtier look to it, I guess. So I'm going to start off by getting a piece of cloth that will fit both of my postcards because I'm going to stitch them on, and I glue them a little bit to hold them in place, but really it's going to be stitched so that it can take some beating when people are opening and closing it. So I have some postcards that are about the same size. It's not perfect because they're all different, but I want it to fold like a book, and I can use the edges of the fabric to add some edge where maybe it's not completely even. So I'm going to just glue down on the corners onto this material. And this material is like made to be wrinkly, so I'm going to leave it that way. I'm not going to iron it or anything. I'm going to use fabric tack so I can get the paper to stick well to my cloth. It is my go-to glue, and that is not an endorsement of the company or by the company. It is just from years of doing this. Now I'm going to try to keep them lined up as best as I can. I'm not the type to measure. I'm too lazy for that. But if you want to measure out to make sure they stay straight, go for it. I'm going to put the writing, I want it to go in opposite directions. Maybe I should go this way. I'm actually going to, I don't know why it feels better, but I like them facing each other. Alright. Now I just did the corners, and what I'm going to do is stitch around the postcards so that they stay solid on there. And then anything that I'm going to add on, I'm going to do stitching before I glue it to the fabric. So we're going to cut this out to make it easier to maneuver in a sewing machine. I'm just going to do a rough cut, and I will cut it back when it's done being stitched. So I'll fold it up and make sure that it lines up because I want the fabric to go out to the same edge, even if the paper isn't the same. Like this one's a little bit bigger, so I gotta leave a bit of an edge on the other postcard. Now I just use fabric for crafting, not for serious sewing, so I don't worry about how messy my cuts are. You may want to be a little bit more prim and proper about it if you use it for making anything else, but that's all I'm using it for. So I'm gonna be right back after I stitch this together. As you can see, I've stitched it together now and cut around the edges to get rid of, or at least make them a little bit evener when I close it. This one I cut right to the postcards. They were very even in size. This one I left a little bit of an edge, and what I want to do is rough up the fabric on the edge so that it evens out the size with a fray, but isn't just like straight material. We'll cut off the longer bits that are left over. Like you can see, this has a long, we'll cut that down when we're done, but going through and fraying it gives us the ability to make it look like they're about the same size while still having that rougher junk journal-y look. This kind of material is really easy to fray, but if you have a quilting cotton, you might need to use scissors at some point to rough it up. I tend to use Tim Holtz scissors for everything because they're great for fabric and paper. I'm sure somewhere someone is annoyed with me for ruining a good pair of scissors by going back and forth between paper and fabric, but or maybe that's just something my mother always said, that maybe it's just like a wise tale. Alright, so I've cut it down. It's got the rough edge. It's stitched around on both sides. The next step is to add some book pages, and we're going to staple them on. So before I put anything on the front or back, I want to get this staple put in place. So we're going to need some paper, some vellum, some cloth, some words. I have this paper that is an old, like, rough sheet for underneath, and when you can see I worked around things and I used extra paint that was on my tools before I cleaned them to use up the paper in a way that I could recycle it then for pages for other things, because I hate to waste anything. So I've cut bits of that old paper to put into this book. I also need to have some, I like to have some old vintage papers like receipts and things. I want some vellum for the top. I have this Halloween, I guess, vellum book. I'm sure there are a million different types of vellum pages. You could just use some like old, what do they call them? I'm thinking of the papers that we used to, transparencies. I don't know why that was hard, but I do have transparencies left over from the transparency phase of school, and you could use something like that, or maybe even tissue paper because it's thinner. The vellum is sturdier, so you can do a little bit more with it. Then when you use transparency, you can't just tear them. You'll have to cut them because they'll tear in weird ways because of the plastic. So this has always been my preference, but I'm going to tear these down to the size of these other pages. So let me get this book out of the way. So if I try to get them about the same size right off the bat, that saves me some work later. I really just need 2 of these, and I'm going to fold them over. Set this aside. So they're going to go over the top and add a little bit of character to those pages. I also have this old packaging, which I love. Sometimes it's hard to use these vintage papers because they just are so beautiful. I think I'm going to tear it so that I just use a lip to fold over, because I want most of this to show. I'm going to be strategic about how I do this, and maybe I'm going to go old school and use a hard book. So I want to have more of a straight line and not that kind of weird jagged that comes from using an artificial ripper. I think this will be about the right size. Let's see. There we go. So this way I can fold this down and the majority of that will show, and I can rip off the bottom. I'm going to do the same thing here. How far do we want to go? Okay. I don't know what you guys use to rip things up. Sometimes I use the edge of the table. Sometimes a hard kid's book. The other piece will be, I need to find some images for behind my material, because I like to have something like that is a surprise when people pull the tuck out. So if I have like not a postcard, like a bookmark or something in there, it will be pretty on its own, but then when you pull it out, then there's a little surprise underneath. So I like to use kids' books. I'm kind of going Valentine's-y-ish in my projects lately. Or like love interest-ish. I don't know what the right term is. But I want to make sure this will fit in the center. I'm going to use something as a... This is about the size of what I'm going to put in there, so I'm going to use it to try to find the image I want. I want to make sure that when I rip it, it's going to be the right size to be kind of central for that paper. So when I put the hole in, I want it to be his face or a specific building, and leaving a frame that will be covered by the material, because we're just going to put a little peekaboo hole in there. I didn't quite rip the way I wanted it to, but that's part of the process, I guess. There we go. So we have one. Let's see if I can find one that is a similar... This is an old book about losing scissors, which I know I always lose my scissors, so... It does have this red line through it, so when I pick the image, I have to be mindful that I'm not putting that weird red line in it, because it won't make sense to the projects that I do. I guess I could, well, that won't line up right. It could just be a town. Now, if I'm gonna try to centralize a part of the town in the peekaboo, I want to make sure that I give it enough of a frame of white that it puts the town in the center. So first thing I'm going to do is just rip this free of the book because it's easier to work with, and get this out of my way. I'm going to make sure that this red mark here is in the framed part, or like behind the frame, because I don't want that showing. It bugs me. People will be like, what in the world is that from? Because they won't know the story. I'm going to take a little bit off the edges here. I think my battery is about to die, so I might have to take a brief interlude. It's not going to let me rip that tiny edge. There we go. So we have our two images. Now we need a contrasting material, and I'm kind of cutting out all my materials at the same time, so then when I do my stitching, I can do it all together. I've got my two images, and I found just some plain material that's just a scrap about the size I need. So I'm just going to cut a section off. Try not to waste all my scrap, if that even makes sense. Now this it's folded over, so there's two here. I'm going to cut along this line, or maybe you just rip it, because I want that rough edge anyway. And then I'm going to rip off all these weird angles. It'll rough it up a little bit and give me this rectangle I want. If I can do it, if I can get my hands around the fabric. That should work. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm not giving myself enough to hold on to. Let's see if we can get a rougher edge on this one. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing to this. Rough this edge up a little bit. Sometimes if you just cut it into it a little bit, you can pull these strings off and fray it easier. I have a bunch of strings to cut off. Okay, so I have the over fabric. Now I'm going to just cut a hole in the center. And rough cut is better. I don't want it to look perfect, and I'm going to stitch around it so it will be sturdy even though I'm giving it a rough cut. I usually cut into the fabric in the center and then just cut out and around in a oval, I guess is the shape I'm going for. And remember, it's just a peekaboo. You don't want to go all the way to the edge, because you are going to be tucking things into this, so you want it to be sturdy enough that you can still tuck your bookmarks in there without the fabric buckling too much. So I have a sort of rough frame like this, not perfectly aligned, not perfectly circular. It's rough on purpose because this is a junk journal and it's not supposed to look perfect. Now these aren't going to be next to each other, so they don't have to be symmetrical. You don't have to think about how they're going to look next to each other. They're going to be on opposite sides. And usually when I make this kind of thing, it's for putting inside a bigger junk journal. So sometimes they're very far apart in the book, so it really does not matter if they look great together or anything. So there I have my two ovals. Now I'm going to stitch around the oval and around the frame, but I have to stitch the oval first and then attach it to this by stitching around the frame. I've stitched together my pockets, and you can see I ended up cutting out a section of it, and I'm really embracing the messy stitching on this project because I realized that you couldn't see enough of his face once I put it all together. So then I went back and glued underneath the stitching to put it back together without having to restitch it and have more layers of stitching. So it minimized the extra effort. I don't sit and pull stitches out when it's on paper because you're just going to massacre the paper anyway. So I have my two pockets. I also have my bundle of papers. So I folded these in half. I folded over the top edge of this scrap paper, and then the vellum I folded. I didn't fold it completely even because I want to make sure it goes almost all the way down, but leaves kind of a rough edge. And I'm just going to rip this extra paper off the end because I need it to be able to fit on here without sticking out of the page. So any of this stuff that's kind of overhanging, I'm going to rip off. So then I'm going to staple it on here. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to rip off the excess. Okay. Now I just use a regular stapler. I put the messy or the bubbly edge of the staple sticking out this way because I'm going to put things over this that will cover it up. So you don't have to go to that level, I guess. It's just, I know it's going to be a little more bumpy. Maybe go down a little bit more. So those bumps that when it folds over, I can cover that better on this side. Then I want this side to stay flat. So I'm going to do that on both sides. Oh, I went a little low on that one, but that's okay. So we have our basic notebooks. Now that we know where the staple's going to be, we can position our pockets to lay over the staples. And I'm just using Fabri-Tac. And I'm going to do around the edges and then a sort of messy center to make sure that the whole thing stays down. Because you have the paper on the other side, that Fabri-Tac isn't going to seep through and show. So you don't have to worry about rubbing it down to a thin layer or any of that. Now let's do the back side. I have all these strings from cutting things off. They're floating around. And speaking of strings, I think I'm going to cut these down. Alright, so I'm filling in the center with glue and the edges. and sticking it down. Make sure it fully sticks, so when you're pulling that tuck in and out, it's not going to come off. So we have our little peekaboos, we have our notebooks. Now we just need some inspiring words and maybe a little bit of background paper for our fabric. I have this leftover fabric from another project, so I think I'm gonna make some little patches here for putting words on. Now for finding the words I want, I usually just use old books. Our library, when they decommission books, they have a little junk journal kind of party. It's not really a class because they don't teach people how to junk journal, but they do give you access to all these old books, and you can pick them apart, rip apart the parts you want, take them with you. So I have a ton of pages from old books, and there's a lot of really interesting sayings you can find if you look in the old English style books. It was done to make a mash of me. I kind of like that one because he looks very distraught in the pictures. Let's see if we can find another one that kind of fits that sort of angst. See, it says, I had been informed. I moreover knew. This is actually talking about an election, but it has great wording. Kept up a constant war on me, fighting with every scurrilous report, while all the attempts were making against me. Let's see. I think, let's see, it says, it was done to make a mash of me. Here it has, which had the desired effect. That's a good one. They go well together. I know some people that have invested in typewriters, but I just know I wouldn't take care of it enough, because then they can just kind of pick what they want to say. But I kind of like having to put the pieces together to make an interesting little saying. It was done to make a mash of me. So we can have 2 lines and a line. Let's see. Could do, kind of give it a similar look. Have a double line. I just gotta figure out how I want to glue them on there. I'm gonna do this separate. Sometimes when I'm doing this stuff, my hands feel so big and clumsy. The older I get, the harder it is to maneuver these little tiny pieces. I have a job that I have to do a lot of typing, and it's definitely had an effect on my hand dexterity. I should probably get one of those carpal tunnel surgeries or something, but I feel like I have enough things going on that I don't want to add something like that to my life. Can't remember where exactly I put it before. That will work. I don't want to cover the words here. There we go. It was done to make a mesh of me. Which had the desired effect. I love it. And I'm kind of trying to go in a similar direction with the words, just so they look like it was intentionally part of the same sentence or same style. I don't know. Sometimes I wish I had younger hands. There we go. So now when I glue them on, I'm going to glue them over the staple that hides the metal in a way that looks classy, and I don't have to like stitch paper onto paper or anything. I want to make sure it covers it. This one's a little bit lower stapled, so I just need to be mindful of that. Ooh, extra string. I tend to pull back to do things like gluing because otherwise my head is in the video and no one wants to see the back of my head. There! We have our little booklet of pages. Then we close it. And it's got him frustrated and then maybe his house in the background. So then when we put some tucks in it, see if I have some that will fit sort of that style. Alright, so we put our tag in, then when they pull it out, they get to see the image. We'll do one on this side too. Oh, I like these ones. These are old cards. I don't have any string in them, but we can throw some string in. If there's string, then you can tuck it a little deeper so that the image shows and people can still get it out. So these old cards, I like to get old game cards, like kids' game cards, because the images are so fun. And you can have the image peeking out. Maybe this one will look better. See if I have some string for this one. Although it's kind of silly, it doesn't really match the theme or anything, but you can get the idea. If we have her peeking through, then if it's bound into a book, you have your tuck that you can pull up and see him frustrated. It goes back in. You open it up, some places to write. There's the vintage postcard. And then the back would be the same kind of thing. So you have your extra. You could cut these down and it'll look even better. There. There. Well, that turned out kind of interesting in the end. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you have as much fun as I did today.